Hi. Hi. So I'm Rabbi Darby Leigh. I was born profoundly deaf in New York City, grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and now I currently serve as the senior rabbi for Congregation Kerem Shalom in Concord, Mass.
With a little bit about your journey as a Jewish person and getting becoming who you are today and what brought you?
I was born profoundly deaf to two deaf parents. Both of my parents happened to be deaf as well. And so some of my earliest Jewish childhood memories are actually at a synagogue for the deaf, or it probably more realistically a small chavurah for the deaf. It was called Temple Beth Or for the Deaf, and it met in Queens, New York. And we actually gathered, Temple Beth Or for the Deaf was gathered in what was the basement of a much larger synagogue, possibly a reform or conservative synagogue. I don't actually remember where it was, but I do know that the deaf chavurah or the deaf synagogue met in the basement. And as a young child, I remember being really confused, walking into this gigantic, beautiful building, walking down this long hallway and passing the main sanctuary on the first floor, which was on my left. I turn, look in the doors, and see these rows of benches with these red velvet plush cushioned, beautiful steps up to the bima, a gorgeous, elaborate arc. And yet my family and I would continue walking down the hall, and we get to a door on the right, which was the stairwell door. And we walk into the stairwell and we'd walk down to the basement. And we arrive in the basement room, which was probably a multi-purpose room or a common room with really horrid fluorescent lighting and these uncomfortable plastic chairs that were set up kind of in a horseshoe shape, and a small kind of movable arc on wheels in the front of the room. And I always remember wondering as a little kid, like, how come we can't sit up there? How come we don't get to sit where those red velvet cushions are? Like, why are we down here with this harsh lighting? And I was a little kid, so I never really pushed the issue, but I always remembered having that nagging question. I have an older sister who's about 2 years older than me, who happened to be fully hearing. So both of my parents and I are profoundly deaf, and my sister is fully hearing. And so the time came to prepare for her bat mitzvah. And I remember being at a meeting in the rabbi's office with both of my parents. Um, I don't actually remember if my sister was there, but with both of my parents, who were asking the rabbi if Central Synagogue would provide an ASL sign language interpreter for my sister's bat mitzvah, so that they and I could have access to understand at least the English that was spoken during the service, as well as friends and family members of our personal community who would be invited to witness and celebrate and support my sister on that day. And I remember the rabbi at the time, saying very clearly, no, I'm sorry, we don't do that. Like there wasn't even there wasn't even a discussion. Understand, this is a long time ago. We've come a long way since then. I'm older, and so this would have been in the 1980s. But I just remember that the door felt like it was closed really firmly, and the message was, no, you don't belong in the same way. We don't do that.
Do you want to talk about how you were? Do you want to go into how you moved away from Judaism and how that you came back to it?
Absolutely. So like I said, a number of these formative experiences in sort of my Jewish childhood and early teen years kind of left me with a really strong sense of alienation, of being an outcast, of not fitting in and not belonging. And to be clear, that wasn't only from the Jewish community. That was just growing up deaf in the mainstream, going to a hearing school, being the only deaf kid everywhere I went, led to just a really strong sense of alienation from society as a whole. And I like to say I became sort of a rebellious, anti-authoritarian, nonconformist. And that manifested itself in a lot of different ways, including experimenting with my appearance, with my cultural affiliations I expressed, the music I would listen to, and with my hair. And you may remember from your own high school, I sort of feel like every high school in North America had one or two kids that are always messing with their hair, like shaving it off, dyeing it different colors, growing it long, cutting a mohawk, whatever it might be. And that was me. So one of the ways I chose to express my difference and my individuality and whatever I was trying to express was through my hair as a sort of a piece of myself that I was able to kind of personalize and use as a way to announce to the world around me that I was different, right? I'm different, deal with me. A sort of very punk rock, heavy metal kind of attitude, quite frankly. And so when I got to college, somebody that I knew suggested to me that with the particular hair that I had, the small Jew fro I have going on at the moment, that I could actually grow dreadlocks with my hair. And I had no idea what dreadlocks were. And he was like, yeah, man, you can grow some fat dreads with that hair. I'm like, dreads? What's that? And so he said, dreadlocks, reggae music, Bob Marley, Rastafari. And I was like, no, deaf guy here. I don't reggae music. What's that? Bob Marley, who's that? And so I began learning. And I was like, oh, Bob Marley, sure. Rasta, reggae, dreadlocks. Yeah, why not? I'm an experimental sort of guy. I'll give that a try. So I began growing dreadlocks. And it became this really interesting, long journey. As my dreadlocks grew, more and more people made lots of assumptions about me, including the fact that I listened to reggae music or that I was Rastafarian, because the Rastas grow their dreadlocks as a way of expressing their spirituality and their religion. Of course, I wasn't, because I'm Jewish, and my Jewish identity has always been really, really strong. That I wasn't going to cut my hair again until it truly felt right. And I didn't cut my hair for 10 years.
Okay, so do you want to talk about maybe the how you became a rabbi and like the synagogue that you are in now, and like what type of accommodations or implementations you put into your synagogue?
Absolutely. So as I said, I've long since been aware. I had long since, going back to my mid-teenage years, been aware of being on this spiritual journey. And people use that expression so often. And I don't know what people mean when they say that. So I try to explain. For me, what that meant was that I was consciously aware of being on a journey to try to come to greater understanding and peace of what it was that I was doing on this planet. Why am I here? Why am I alive? What's this all about? And so that journey took me through this, exploration with my hair, which brought me back to Judaism. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had learned so much throughout all of my experiences being deaf, having dreadlocks, touring, everything I was doing, that it was time to learn Torah and to see if there was a way to sort of give some of that learning back. So that's the piece of the Torah that I preach, is that, providing access to your community has to start with obviously the desire to be accessible, and sometimes and then a willingness to work in relationship and in partnership with people with disabilities or whomever it might be that requesting the access or wants the access. But that partnership has to be a little bit deeper in two different ways. Well, actually, let me just say at the outset that I also think it's true that a lot of organizations may want to be accessible, but may sort of be afraid to try because they'll feel like we're not doing enough, we're not doing it all, we're not doing it right, we're going to get it wrong, we're going to make mistakes. So you know what? We just don't do anything. And if I were to leave people with any thought, I would just say, the thought, just do something. Make one effort. Because if you make one effort and you touch one person and you connect one person and you bring them to a meaningful journey through life, then that's huge. And that one leads to more and many more, perhaps. But the desire has to also not just be about a desire on the part of the institutions and the organizations and the community to be accessible so that the Jews with disabilities or people with disabilities can come and partake of what we have to offer. It's such an arrogant and it's such an authoritarian view of, we have it. And if you want to come and have some of it, what we have, we'll try to make it accessible for you. Instead of what I try to do, which is put a little spin on it to say, until people with disabilities are in your community, you don't have it, right? You actually don't, because having that perspective and having the presence And having a community that truly reflects the full spectrum of God's creation is what it is. And if you don't have that, if you don't have single and interfaith families and Jews of color and people with disabilities in your community, folks who are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, queer, gender non-conforming, if you don't have those individuals in your community, then you don't have a community that reflects the spectrum of God's creation. And if you don't have a community that reflects the spectrum of God's creation, then you have a private club. You have a private country club where membership is restricted to a particular social, economic, and racial class of people who look like you, talk like you, have the same educational background as you, have the same financial resources as you, and you're all kind of this homogenous group. And many synagogues look like that. And that's not a synagogue, as I understand it. That is a private country club. And if that's what you want, but then you're missing out on one of the true riches, on some of the true riches that belonging to a true synagogue, belonging to a true community can actually give you. So it's not about, accessibility is not about what can we do to provide access to those poor people with disabilities, but we're deprived. We don't have, I don't have full understanding of what it might mean to daven in a community and say Shema until I've done it with someone who can't hear. What did it mean to say Shema sitting next to someone who does not hear with their ears? Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a whole nother level of meaning to this sacred text that I would never have access to if I wasn't confronted with the reality of what it means to engage in Torah with the true diversity of the Jewish community.
Do you want to say anything else before we end the interview?
My last piece of Torah is to treat everybody with kindness and to try to be gentle and compassionate with ourselves and to begin from wherever we are.